There are times, not often in human history, when the urge to build conspires with a vision of beauty. When the will to achieve conspires with the skill to create. What is born is that rare thing, a work of wonder. A work that gives pause, that catches the breath, that seems to cry out, behold what we can accomplish. These are the enduring works of man's own creation. Lasting testaments of an eternal struggle to leave a mark on a fleeting world. There is a palace so majestic, so lavish, so excessively aristocratic, that it bears a double legacy as both the capital of European artistry and the very symbol of royal arrogance. Versailles began as an act of jealousy. Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, had visited the magnificent chateau of one of his ministers. So outraged was the king at the lavish appointments of his subordinate chateau that the king imprisoned him and looted his home. The booty would soon find its place in a new palace that Louis ordered built for himself. He chose a swampy site at Versailles, 11 miles southwest of Paris. As a boy, he had grown fond of his father's hunting lodge here. Versailles would be the new court of France. More than 22,000 laborers were brought in to transform 250 acres of marsh into the most beautiful palace and gardens in the world. Vistas were created where none had existed. Rivers were redirected to pour millions of gallons of water into 400 fountains. When the stench of Versailles' latrines became too strong, Louis had 3,000 fragrant trees in boxes strategically arranged. Some of them survive to this day in l'Orangerie. In fact, Versailles represents the pinnacle of Baroque sensibility. Here, nature was tamed and sometimes tortured into submission. Every twig and branch at Versailles, every natural outcropping was subject to revision. Trees were set back slightly from the long pathways so that they would not cast shadows on the magnificent statues that dot the gardens. Potted plants, some 150,000 of them, were changed as often as 15 times a year so that Versailles was always in flower. The buildings of Versailles also impose a rational, man-made order on a scale of incomprehensible luxury. Louis wanted a palace where he could keep an eye on the intrigues of the court. So Versailles was built to house some 3,000 noblemen, courtiers, ladies-in-waiting, and all of their attendants. 700 rooms were adorned with marble, brocade, velvet, and gold. Versailles became the living quarters and meeting rooms for the French aristocracy. Since Louis loved to live in the public eye, he kept the palace open to all who came to gawk. At the exact architectural center of this gilded beehive was Louis's own bedchamber. The day started here not with sunrise, but with kingrise, a ritual called lever du roi. Louis had an attendant for every function, one to don the left sleeve, another the right, one to place the cravat, another to tie it. 4,000 servants and 500 cooks fed the court's ravenous appetite for ceremony. Days at court were spent in an intricate web of receptions, meetings, meals, theatrical performances, plays, gambling, assignations, and elegant balls. The king often participated in the performances of folkloric ballets. It was understood that only the king would join the dancers. The Galerie des Glaces was one of dozens of reception rooms. The hall's 400 mirrors are oriented to set the room ablaze at sunset. Here in the drawing room, adjacent to the Hall of Mirrors, courtiers rose in rank or fell into disfavor according to the changing fashions of the day. The smallest affectation of the king, whether in dress, cuisine, dance, or art, would soon become the rage not only in France, but in all the courts of Europe. And a similar power fell upon the fortunate mistress who had most recently caught the eye of the king. The Marquise de Montespan held sway for quite a while. Since Louis wanted to spend time with her away from the eyes of the court, he built a separate miniature chateau on the grounds of Versailles, Le Grand Trianon. In 1715, Louis was succeeded by his great-grandson, Louis XV, who himself expanded Versailles under the influence of another remarkable woman, Madame du Pompadour, his lover of 20 years. She too wanted a hideaway from the court, and so built Le Petit Trianon. But she did not live to see it completed, and it became the hideaway of the king and his newest favorite, the Comtesse du Barry. But it was another woman of Versailles who would come to epitomize the excesses of the French court, Marie Antoinette. The Austrian-born Marie came to live in this bedroom at Versailles in what was an unpopular, politically arranged marriage to Louis XVI. She never gained the favor of the French people, though she did her best to impress the court. Marie also had a penchant for rustic living, or at least a royal version of it. To indulge her taste for the countryside, a charming false village was erected with its own little mill and carefully antiqued cottages, cracked walls and all. It was in this idyllic setting, on October 5th, 1789, that Marie was alerted to startling news. The French Revolution had come to Versailles. Angry Parisians were descending upon the palace. The royal family left the next morning and would never return. And Versailles, which only 6 years before had witnessed the signing of the treaty that gave America its independence, now became a hated symbol of tyranny in its own land. "80 years later, the American author Mark Twain visited Versailles. Even this most democratic of tourists marveled at what he saw.
I used to abuse Louis XIV for spending $200 million when bread was so scarce, but I have forgiven him now. It is wonderfully beautiful to gaze and stare and try to understand that it is real, that it is on the earth, that it is not the Garden of Eden. And you half believe that you are the dupe of an exquisite dream."
While Americans hailed their newly imported marvel, back in Paris, the French were building one they'd keep for themselves. The same engineer who had built the framework for the Statue of Liberty had been given the commission of his career. Gustave Αϊφελ, bridge builder and structural engineer, was to create a monument for the centennial of the French Revolution. Αϊφελ knew both his history and his metallurgy. Cast iron would allow him to build a monumental structure with an impact worthy of the Revolution. He planned a tower of dizzying height, nearly 1,000 feet of iron latticework. It would remain the tallest structure in the world for 40 years. Αϊφελ used new technologies of prefabrication to forge 12,000 girders. They were manufactured off-site and assembled in place on the left bank of the Seine. 2.5 million rivets held up the iron latticework, which allowed the winds to pass through freely. More dangerous were the stings of critics who practically brought the project to a standstill. A prominent group of artists and intellectuals, including the writer Guy de Maupassant and the composer Charles Gounod, signed a published letter decrying the monstrosity arising over their beloved Paris.
The useless and monstrous Eiffel Tower is like a gigantic black factory chimney.
Crushing with its barbarous mass, Notre Dame,
Le Louvre, l'Arc de Triomphe.
All our monuments humiliated under this black blot.
Unfazed, Αϊφελ pressed on. The tower was completed on schedule in just over 600 working days and dedicated on March 31st, 1889. More than 2 million curious Parisians flocked to the tower that first year, scratching their names on the beams and buying souvenirs. They took midday meals in the platform restaurant and rode the ingenious elevators that scuffle along curving metalwork to reveal what they had never seen before. One visitor was Edmond de Goncourt.
Going up in the lift, I had a feeling in the pit of my stomach, as if I were on a ship at sea, but no dizziness. Up there, we were afforded a realization beyond anything imaginable on ground level. Of the greatness, the extent, the Babylonian immensity of Paris.
The tower changed the way Parisians saw the world around them. No longer merely a city of streets and boulevards. Paris now had a startling new vista of sky and horizon, patterns of color and patches of light. And the artists of Paris took in the view with new eyes. The city's painters, already revolutionizing the art world, now had a landmark worthy of their modern vision. In a way, Αϊφελ had forged in steel what artists were creating with oils. Georges Seurat took the most basic elements of painting, light and color, and by applying them precisely, produced an overall impression of weightless, timeless beauty. So too, Αϊφελ sculpted with some of architecture's essential components. Girders and rivets were employed to create a structural design that, when seen from afar, seems somehow to resolve in an airy, ageless silhouette. Later, a coating of orange paint was added, gradually fading to a pale yellow, to increase the impression that the tower was floating on the skyline. But even after its completion, there were critics. De Maupassant stood by his earlier condemnation. In fact, he claimed to enjoy dining in the tower because it was the only place in Paris where he didn't have to look at it. The tower was even scheduled for demolition in 1909. Only its newfound use as a radio tower preserved it. And when its height helped to intercept German army transmissions during World War I, the tower's permanence was guaranteed. Ironically, what once was a symbol of a revolution, of progress and mass production, today seems rather quaint. A bit of old-world elegance in a frantic metropolis. But for its time, the tower represented a daring step. It thrust up its welcome to the modern age. It matched beauty with technology, asserting that the two could coexist. This claim alone may make La Tour Eiffel, the Eiffel Tower, the most optimistic wonder ever built. And perhaps the most poignant.